In September 2022, construction crews broke ground on the south side of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York. The machines moved in, the concrete started coming up, and the old terminals began to fall. It was supposed to be a straightforward demolition. What nobody fully reckoned with was what had been sleeping under that ground for centuries, and what it would mean to disturb it. Long before there was an airport, before there was a golf course, before there was even a city sprawling across every shoreline in sight, there was Jamaica Bay. 18,000 years ago, the glaciers that had buried the northeastern coast of North America began their slow retreat north. What they left behind in Queens, in Brooklyn, across the barrier islands of the Rockaways, was one of the richest coastal ecosystems on the eastern seaboard. The bay that formed in their wake was a world of salt marsh and tidal flat, of shallow channels threading through grassy wetland islands, of forests pressing close to the water's edge. Deer moved through it, bears, osprey overhead, and beavers, so many beavers working the estuaries, that the Lenape people who lived there named the whole place after them. Yamako, the place of the beaver. Over time, through Dutch phonetics and English mouths, that name became Jamaica. The Canarsie, a band of Munsee-speaking Lenape, had been living along Jamaica Bay for thousands of years before any European wrote a word about this part of the world. Their main village sat somewhere near what we now call Canarsie in Brooklyn, and their territory stretched across much of southeastern Queens and the bay beyond. They fished the waters. They harvested oysters from reefs so vast and so dense that they shaped the whole ecology of the estuary. They farmed corn in the uplands. They moved with the seasons, building longhouses from saplings and bark and clay, leaving a light mark on a land they understood to be alive. Archaeologists working in Queens have identified around 80 Lenape habitation sites across New York City's 5 boroughs. Shell middens, the accumulated remains of thousands of years of shellfish harvesting, have been found throughout the region. These were not temporary camps. They were places people came back to, generation after generation, because the bay provided. In 1636, Dutch settlers from New Amsterdam purchased large tracts of land around Jamaica Bay. What followed over the next century was the pattern that played out across the entire eastern seaboard: disease, displacement, the slow erasure of a people who had no legal framework to contest what was being done to their land. By the early 1700s, the Canarsie had largely been absorbed into other Lenape communities moving west and north, away from the coast. Their name stayed on the map. They did not. The land that remained along Jamaica Bay passed through the hands of Dutch farmers, English colonists, and eventually the developers and resort builders of the late 19th century. In 1899, the New York Times noted a park about 25 miles from Manhattan with dancing pavilions, saloons, a pier, and a shooting gallery. It was called Idlewild, a recreational spot for the wealthy who summered on Long Island. William Vanderbilt had a house nearby. The name, as one account later explained, came from the fact that the site was wild, and the hotel and park served as a recreational facility for the idle rich. In November 1929, a developer named Nathan D. Shapiro assembled 300 acres of meadowland on Jamaica Bay and called his company the Idlewild Beach Company. He built 2 golf courses, one public and one private, and hosted tournaments of increasing prominence throughout the 1930s. That is the world that existed on this ground within living memory. A coastal resort, a golf club, marshland full of birds, water full of fish, and below all of it, the layered remains of everything that had come before. In late 1941, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia announced that New York City had chosen a large area of marshland on Jamaica Bay as the site for a new airport. LaGuardia Airport, named for him and opened only 2 years earlier, was already struggling to handle the volume of traffic that the war and commercial aviation were generating. New York needed something bigger, and the marshy ground of the former Idlewild Resort was available. Title to the land was conveyed to the city at the end of December 1941. Construction began in 1943. Though the airport's final layout was still being debated, the plan, as it evolved, was enormous. From an initial footprint of about 1,000 acres, the project would eventually consume nearly 5,000. To make that ground solid enough for runways and terminals, workers dredged sand from the bottom of Jamaica Bay and pumped it over the marshland in massive fill operations. The wetlands that had existed there for thousands of years were buried under several feet of sand. The creeks were blocked. The tidal channels were cut off. The vegetation died. And under all of it, sealed away, went whatever had accumulated in that soil over centuries. The airport that opened on July 1st, 1948, as New York International Airport, known to everyone simply as Idlewild, was built on what had effectively been a living ecosystem. President Harry S. Truman attended the opening ceremony. 6 runways were ready, with a 7th under construction. Within a few years, Idlewild had the highest volume of international air traffic of any airport in the world. On December 24, 1963, a month and 2 days after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the airport was renamed in his honor. Senator Ted Kennedy and Jean Kennedy Smith attended the ceremony at the old International Arrivals Building. The name Idlewild, with all its layered history, officially disappeared from the maps. What didn't disappear was what lay beneath the tarmac. By 2017, JFK was ranked 59th among the world's top 100 airports by Skytrax. The terminals were overcrowded. The roads were a confusion of intersecting loops, and the passenger experience had fallen far behind what the airport's status demanded. Governor Andrew Cuomo announced a plan to transform the entire facility, a vision that would eventually carry a price tag of $19 billion. At the center of that vision was a new Terminal 1. The existing Terminal 1, Terminal 2, and the site of the former Terminal 3 would all be demolished. In their place, a 2.4 million square foot international terminal would rise, with 23 gates, more than 300,000 square feet of retail and dining space, and first gates scheduled to open in 2026. The project was privately financed at $9.5 billion, the largest such airport financing in American history. On September 8, 2022, Governor Kathy Hochul stood at the groundbreaking ceremony and called it a historic new chapter for the city, the state, and the community of Queens. Terminal 3, known to an earlier generation as Pan Am's Worldport, had already been demolished in 2013. Terminal 2 closed to passengers on January 14, 2023, after more than 60 years of operation. It had opened on November 18, 1962, jointly operated by Braniff, Northwest, and Northeast Airlines, 3 carriers that no longer exist. The building itself was one of the original pieces of what planners in the 1960s had called Terminal City, the ring of individual airline terminals that made JFK unusual among airports of its era. Each airline, domestic and foreign, had been given the opportunity to commission its own building. The result was a campus of architectural statements, some iconic, some merely functional, all of it now being stripped back to the earth. When the excavators moved into the former Terminal 3 site, and then the Terminal 2 footprint, they were going through layer after layer of mid-20th century construction. Concrete foundations, utility conduits, drainage systems, the bones of a post-war building boom that had transformed this marshland into an international gateway. But underneath all of that, once the modern fill was penetrated, was something else entirely. The ground that construction crews encountered was not simply inert substrate. It was the compressed remains of the original Jamaica Bay wetlands, preserved in the anaerobic conditions beneath the airport's fill layer since 1943. Wetland soils hold things: pollen, seeds, organic material that dates back centuries. The specific conditions of salt marsh, where oxygen is limited and decomposition is slow, can preserve biological records going back thousands of years. The fill that buried this marsh in the early 1940s essentially sealed it. What lay beneath the airport was not just old ground, it was an archive. The numbers tell one part of the story. Between 1924 and 1974, Jamaica Bay lost 1,290 acres of marshland. Of that, 780 acres were lost specifically to landfilling and dredging, the same process that built JFK and Floyd Bennett Field across the bay. Another 526 acres disappeared between 1974 and 1994. By 2007, the bay was losing wetland at a rate of 33 acres per year. Of the original 65 square kilometers of wetland that once surrounded the bay, only about 16 remain. The airport did not cause all of that loss on its own. Development pressure across the entire bay watershed, bulkheaded shorelines, polluted runoff, and rising sea levels all played a role. But the construction of Idlewild and its subsequent expansions represented the single largest act of wetland destruction in the bay's history. Nearly 5,000 acres of what had been living marsh, tidal flat, and upland habitat was paved over in a matter of years. In 2020 alone, communities surrounding Jamaica Bay flooded 15 times. The connection between the loss of wetlands and the flooding of neighborhoods is not theoretical. Marshland absorbs storm surge. It filters water. It provides habitat for the fish and birds that depend on the bay's food chain. When you bury it, those services disappear, and the consequences radiate outward for generations. The current construction project at JFK is, in a legal sense, required to reckon with some of this. Environmental reviews conducted as part of the new Terminal 1 approval process identified the need to assess and mitigate impacts on Jamaica Bay's remaining wetland ecosystem. The construction site sits within the broader Jamaica Bay watershed, which since 1972 has been partly protected as part of the Gateway National Recreation Area. The tension between building one of the largest airport terminals in North America and protecting what remains of a coastal ecosystem that was already severely diminished is not easily resolved. And then there is the older history below the wetlands themselves. The Canarsie people, who fished and farmed along this bay for thousands of years, left traces in the soil wherever they camped, cooked, and buried their dead. Archaeologists have identified around 80 Lenape habitation sites across New York City. The Jamaica Bay area, with its exceptional food resources, its seasonal abundance of shellfish, and its sheltered waters, would have been used consistently for a very long time. What exactly lies beneath the airport's fill layer, in that regard, has never been fully surveyed. The original construction in 1943 was done without any systematic archaeological review. The ground was dredged and filled with speed, under wartime urgency, with no one pausing to ask what might be lost. By the time Phase A of the new Terminal 1 opens, the south side of JFK will look nothing like it did in 1960. The old ring of competing airline terminals, each one a statement of mid-century ambition, will be gone. In their place will be a single, unified structure, with glass walls that rise above the aircraft ramp, designed to let travelers see from the drop-off curb all the way through to the plains beyond. It will be, by every architectural and operational measure, a significant improvement on what it replaced. But the ground it stands on carries a history that the building itself cannot contain or represent. The Canarsie people, whose name marks a neighborhood just across the bay from the airport's south perimeter, lived on and around Jamaica Bay for thousands of years before the Dutch arrived in 1636. Their middens, their trails, their seasonal camps, their understanding of a landscape that Europeans would spend the next 3 centuries filling, draining, and paving. All of it is present in the sediment beneath the asphalt, buried under the weight of what we built on top. The bay they fished is still there, diminished. The Gateway National Recreation Area protects most of the remaining open water and marsh. The Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, sitting just south of the airport's runways, hosts more than 330 species of birds on their Atlantic flyway migrations. Schools of fish move through the channels. Osprey nest on platforms erected by the National Park Service. The ecosystem did not die. It was pushed to the edges and protected there, while the center was given over to aircraft and asphalt. What the current construction has forced, at least in part, is a confrontation with how little documentation exists of what was there before. When workers break through concrete and enter the fill layer that was poured in the 1940s, they encounter compressed marsh. Below that, in some locations, are the undisturbed remnants of a landscape that was alive when the Canarsie were fishing it, when Nathan Shapiro was building his golf course, when Dutch farmers were working their fields near the bay's edge. No dramatic single discovery stopped the machines. The history beneath JFK was not unearthed in one moment of crisis. It is more that the accumulated weight of what this site represents has slowly become harder to ignore. The wetlands buried to build the airport are now the wetlands that the city wishes it had back, to buffer the flooding that threatens the neighborhoods surrounding the bay. The indigenous presence erased by 3 centuries of development is now acknowledged, formally, in the land recognition statements of institutions across the region. The Canarsie Indians, the signs and scholarly literature now clarify, called this place home. The beavers are gone. The salt marshes are mostly gone. The golf course is gone. The old terminals are being demolished one by one. What remains, and what the digging keeps returning to, is the ground itself. Layers of sand and fill and compressed organic material, each one representing a choice that someone made about what this place was for. The Canarsie made one kind of choice, one that left the bay largely intact for thousands of years. The 1940s made another. The question now being asked quietly beneath all the ceremony of groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings is whether this time, building the future on top of a buried past, the people doing the digging understand what they are standing on.